A slap. That's all it took to shatter Ethan Lawson's world. What began as a routine stop on a cold New York street quickly spirals into a deadly game when he discovers the man he just struck isn't just a random suspect, but the feared king of the city's underworld. Now, with his family in danger and the law working against him, Ethan must navigate a world where power is everything and loyalty is a currency he no longer trusts. Will he survive the war he's unleashed, or will Malachi's empire crush him first? Like and subscribe, and let us know where you are watching from in the comment section. The streetlights flickered as Detective Ethan Lawson prowled the dark alley, his steps echoing through the empty night. His shift was ending, but something about the quiet didn't sit right. New York didn't do silence, not here, not in these streets. And tonight he felt the weight of it. Ahead, a figure leaned casually against a brick wall, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. Ethan's gut tightened. He'd seen that look before, that unbothered calm that spelled trouble. Without thinking twice, Ethan approached, his hand brushing the cold metal of his badge. "You think you can loiter here like you own the place?" he challenged, his voice low, unwavering. The man tilted his head, unfazed, meeting Ethan's glare with a steady, unreadable gaze. "Just minding my own business, officer," he replied, his tone smooth as glass. Ethan didn't buy it. He felt a flash of heat, a familiar anger rising in him. Before he knew it, his hand shot out, a sharp slap cracking through the night. The man's head snapped to the side, but he stayed silent, only his gaze darkening. At that moment, Ethan felt a prickle of dread. He didn't know who this man was, but the silence that followed was chilling. It wasn't fear, it was something darker. Something that whispered, "You've crossed a line." As he walked away, Ethan felt the weight of unseen eyes. And the message was clear. This was far from over. The next morning, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message before dawn broke. Groggy, he glanced at the screen and felt a chill cut through his exhaustion. "You made a mistake, detective. Now it's my move." He jolted upright, the message replaying in his mind as he dressed and headed into the precinct. The sender was anonymous. His instincts, sharpened by years on the force, screamed at him that this was no empty threat. This was real. As he entered his office, another officer, Detective Marks, gave him a sideways look. "Saw the clip last night. A bit rough, don't you think?" Marks muttered, his tone somewhere between curious and cautious. "Guy needed to learn some respect," Ethan shot back, trying to ignore the unsettling look in his colleague's eyes. But he could feel it, the whispers, the glances, the unspoken judgment filling the room. He shook it off and dove into his work, but the day felt like wading through quicksand. By noon, he'd already noticed small things missing, a file on a recent case, a form he'd just printed. Then he saw it. On his desk sat a small black envelope, as if it had appeared from thin air. He opened it, and a single card dropped out. "Watch yourself. Everyone else is." That night, as he left the precinct, a black car tailed him for blocks, staying just far enough to remain a shadow. When it finally turned off, Ethan's pulse still pounded, a bitter reminder. He was being watched, and he had no idea who or what he was up against. Ethan barely slept that night, the warning card's message repeating in his mind like a taunt. By morning, he was at the precinct early, sifting through paperwork and trying to find any information on the man from last night. But the system came up empty. It was as if the guy didn't exist. Just then, Captain Roberts approached, her eyes sharp as she handed him a file. "Stay off this one, Lawson," she said, her voice laced with unspoken warning. Ethan frowned, flipping open the folder. It contained only one photo, the man he'd slapped. His blood ran cold. "What's this about, Captain?" She met his gaze, her expression hard. "You don't understand the kind of power you're dealing with. Do you want to keep your badge? Drop it?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "So I'm just supposed to let him intimidate me? Consider it survival," she said, turning on her heel and walking away, leaving him with the uncomfortable reminder that he was alone in this. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself checking over his shoulder. Colleagues he'd trusted for years seemed distant, their eyes skimming over him with something between pity and caution. That night, when he pulled into his driveway, he froze. His front door was ajar. Heart pounding, he stepped inside, calling out to his wife, Sarah. She was in the kitchen, unharmed but shaken, her face pale. On the counter lay another note, its message simple: family can be fragile, detective. Don't test me. The threat was clear, and it cut deeper than any warning. Ethan sat in his dimly lit living room that night, every shadow casting an edge sharper than he remembered. His wife, Sarah, was upstairs, pretending to sleep. But he knew better. She was worried, though trying to keep a brave face for their daughter. The message left on the counter had done its job. It struck him where it hurt the most. The next day at the precinct, Ethan barely got his coffee before he was called into a meeting with the commissioner. Commissioner Daly was a man with a reputation for being untouchable, but today his calm demeanor seemed tinged with unease. "You've made yourself a target, Lawson," Daly began without preamble. "Some people aren't pleased with the attention you're bringing to certain influential circles." Ethan felt his blood boil. "So I'm just supposed to back off because he's influential? Since when did we answer to people like him?" Daly leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This isn't about one man, Ethan. This city's a machine, and some of its gears run darker. You're meddling with things bigger than you understand." Ethan clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. But before he could respond, Daly continued, "You're being reassigned. Effective immediately." As he walked out, anger and frustration twisted inside him. He was sure now, someone was tightening the noose, forcing him out. But this wasn't over. He knew exactly what he had to do. That night, as he pulled into his driveway, headlights flashed behind him. A sleek black car pulled up, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, smirking. "Detective Lawson, I presume? A word of advice: stop digging. Or next time, we won't be so gentle." Before Ethan could respond, the car was gone, leaving him in silence. But his mind was anything but quiet. Ethan's gut twisted as he watched the taillights of the black car disappear into the night. He'd been warned, pressured, and threatened, but he'd never felt so outmatched. As he stepped inside, he saw Sarah waiting for him in the dim light of the kitchen, worry etched across her face. "You can't keep doing this, Ethan," she said quietly, crossing her arms. "They're watching us, following us. Our daughter, she's scared." "I'm scared." He reached for her, but she stepped back. "You're bringing this into our home." Ethan's hands dropped to his sides, his jaw tight. "I'm trying to protect us, Sarah. There's a man out there who thinks he owns this city, who thinks he can walk all over anyone who stands in his way. I can't just sit back and let that happen." Sarah's voice softened, a mix of pleading and fear. "But at what cost, Ethan? Is proving a point worth risking our lives?" As they spoke, the doorbell rang. Sarah tensed, but Ethan motioned for her to stay back. He opened the door to find his daughter standing there, holding the hand of a boy he didn't recognize. The boy's face was solemn, his eyes sharp and observant, a mirror of his own daughter's unease. "Daddy," his daughter whispered, glancing at her friend. "This is Alex. He just moved to town." But Ethan's gut told him something was off. This wasn't a coincidence. "Nice to meet you, Alex," he said, forcing a smile. The boy gave a small nod, his gaze unwavering. "Nice to meet you too, sir." Ethan's mind raced as he shook the boy's hand. He had a sinking feeling he knew who Alex's father was. The connection wasn't just a coincidence. This was Malachi's son. That night, as he watched his daughter play with Alex, the reality set in. His family was now directly entangled with the very man he was trying to stop. His only ally now was Detective Marks, who caught him sifting through the files. "Ethan," Marks said, voice barely above a whisper, "you're playing with fire. Malachi isn't just some thug. He has politicians, judges, even cops under his thumb." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "I don't care who he controls. I'm done living in fear. I need to hit back." Marks shook his head, glancing around nervously. "If you're serious about this, you'll need leverage. Something he can't ignore." As they spoke, the precinct's intercom crackled, announcing an urgent call. Ethan felt a chill as the message came through *, "Detective Lawson, there's been an incident at your daughter's school." Ethan's blood turned to ice. He bolted from the precinct, racing to the school, his heart pounding with dread. When he arrived, he found his daughter unharmed but visibly shaken. Next to her was Alex, his face pale. They were silent, but their eyes told him everything. Someone had sent a message, a clear warning that no one was safe. Ethan knelt, holding his daughter's hand, his voice low. "What happened?" His daughter looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. They said you should stop or they'll make you pay." Ethan's hand tightened around hers, rage flaring in his chest. This was no longer about justice or revenge. It was about survival. And he was ready to cross any line to protect his family. Ethan sat in silence, watching his daughter and Alex in the living room, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The lines he thought he'd drawn to protect his family had already been crossed, shattered by Malachi's reach. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just a battle for justice. It was a war for survival. The next morning he was back at the precinct, hoping to find anything that could give him an advantage. He'd been pulled from active cases, his work hours cut, and his fellow officers kept their distance. But that didn't stop him. In the back files, buried under layers of bureaucracy, he found a record of an old case involving Malachi's operations. Names, locations, minor players, pieces he could use. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of rage and fear as he drove his daughter home from school. Malachi had crossed the line, targeting his family to send a message. But instead of retreating, Ethan felt a steely resolve hardening within him. He'd been backed into a corner, and he was ready to hit back. After putting his daughter to bed, Ethan made a call to Detective Marks. "Meet me at the old docks at midnight. Don't bring anyone." When Marks arrived, Ethan laid out his plan. "If Malachi wants a war, we're giving him one," Ethan said, his voice edged with fury. He pulled out the files he'd taken from the precinct earlier. "These are minor players in Malachi's circle. If we can flip a few of them, we can get to the people who know his operations." Marks looked at him, skeptical. "Ethan, if we go down this path, there's no coming back. He's got allies everywhere, people who will protect him no matter what." "Then we don't give them the chance," Ethan replied, eyes cold. "We hit his businesses, make it clear he's vulnerable. We make him bleed until he has no choice but to face me." They spent the night going through every detail, piecing together a strategy to dismantle Malachi's empire, one piece at a time. By dawn, they had a plan to shake Malachi's world. Over the next week, Ethan and Marks struck from the shadows. Late-night raids, anonymous tips, and files leaked to the press. Malachi's nightclubs, safe houses, and cash fronts found themselves under unexpected scrutiny. Police were everywhere, disrupting operations and drawing attention to his network. Each hit made it harder for Malachi to operate, eroding his influence bit by bit. But the deeper Ethan went, the more he realized just how vast Malachi's empire truly was, and how willing Malachi was to protect it. After one raid, a message arrived, ominous and clear. "One more step, and your family pays." Ethan knew he was on borrowed time. The final showdown was drawing closer, and with each hit he delivered, the stakes climbed higher. He'd started a war, and he'd fight it to the bitter end, no matter the cost. The days blurred together as Ethan and Marks moved like ghosts through the city, dismantling Malachi's empire piece by piece. But with every success, the danger grew. The phone calls, the late-night surveillance, the unmarked cars that followed him when he thought no one was watching. Malachi wasn't just a crime lord, he was a strategist, a kingpin with decades of experience, and Ethan was only a pawn in his game. One night, as Ethan stood on the roof of his apartment building, watching the city below, a call came in. It was from Sarah, and her voice was shaking. "Ethan, something's happened. You need to come home." He didn't wait for her to say more. He was in the car before she finished speaking, racing through the streets, his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived home, the door was wide open, and the inside of the house was eerily quiet. The smell of burnt coffee hung in the air. He called for Sarah, but there was no answer. Suddenly, the phone rang again. His blood went cold when he saw the number, an unknown number with a New York area code. He answered without hesitation, his voice low and steady. "Where is she?" Malachi's voice echoed in his ear, smooth as ever. "She's fine, for now. But if you don't stop this madness, Ethan, you'll never see her again. "You've made your choice, now deal with the consequences." The line went dead, and Ethan was left standing there, the weight of Malachi's words pressing down on him like a leaden vice. He had crossed a line. He'd started a war, and now the cost was no longer just his own life, it was his family's. But he wasn't going to stop. Malachi had made a mistake. He had underestimated Ethan. And now, the tables were about to turn. That night, Ethan called Marks, his voice unwavering. "We're hitting him where it hurts. We take down his family, his allies, and everything he holds dear. It ends tonight." The war was no longer just between two men. It was a battle for everything Ethan had left. And he would burn the city to the ground to win. The plan was simple, but it carried a heavy weight. Ethan and Marks spent the next 48 hours preparing, tracking down every lead they could find on Malachi's allies. Every business, every home, every person who owed him loyalty was a target. They would hit his operations all at once, throwing the entire city into chaos. And in the confusion, they would make Malachi bleed. Ethan knew it wasn't going to be clean. The deeper he dug, the more he realized just how many people were tied to Malachi, directly or indirectly. His influence stretched far beyond the criminal world, into the city's highest echelons of power. Politicians, businessmen, judges, there was no telling how many lives Malachi had ruined to build his empire. As night fell, the two detectives split up, each tasked with taking down a different part of Malachi's operation. Ethan's target was the heart of it all, a sprawling, hidden warehouse where Malachi stored illicit goods and laundered money. It was guarded and fortified, but Ethan knew it was the key to breaking Malachi's hold on the city. The plan was in motion. He slipped through the back entrance of the warehouse, silent as a shadow. Marks would be creating a diversion on the other side, drawing the guards away. Ethan's pulse quickened as he moved deeper into the building, every step closer to Malachi's empire and to his family's salvation. But as he reached the inner offices, the sound of footsteps stopped him cold. He wasn't alone. A figure stepped into view from the shadows, dressed in black, eyes hidden behind a mask. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The figure moved swiftly, like a predator hunting its prey, and before Ethan could react, the figure lunged at him, a gun pressed against his side. "Not so fast, detective," the masked figure whispered. The world seemed to slow. At that moment, Ethan knew he had been outplayed. Malachi had anticipated his every move. This wasn't just a trap, it was a message. The game was over. But Ethan refused to go down without a fight. He lunged, knocking the gun away, but the figure was faster. A punch to his gut sent him crashing to the floor. Blood spilled from his mouth, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to give up. "You think you're the only one with plans, Lawson?" The figure sneered. "You're just a pawn." As Ethan struggled to his feet, the masked figure pulled a phone from their pocket. "This ends now." The screen lit up, and Ethan's blood ran cold. There on the display was a picture of Sarah, tied up, gagged, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan's world exploded in a surge of rage and desperation. He was too late. Malachi had won. Ethan's world had narrowed to the faint, flickering image of Sarah on the phone. He could hear her muffled sobs and feel the rage and desperation building inside him like an inferno. The masked figure before him wasn't just an obstacle, it was a herald of the final choice he had to make. The masked figure smirked. "Time's up, detective. You're too deep now. You should have listened." Ethan's blood burned. He didn't have the luxury of hesitation anymore. In one fluid motion, he reached for the gun at his waist and fired. The shot was precise, a single bullet that struck the phone from the figure's hand, shattering it into pieces. The masked figure recoiled, cursing under their breath, and Ethan lunged at them, the fight now a blur of blood, fists, and adrenaline. But this wasn't just about survival. Ethan knew there was something more at stake: his own humanity. The deeper he fought, the more he realized that he wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for his soul. As the fight ended, and the masked figure lay unconscious on the floor, Ethan's mind raced. His thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear: the man behind this, the man he had been chasing all this time, wasn't just a criminal. He was a reflection of everything that had gone wrong in Ethan's life. Greed, power and control. Malachi's empire was built on these lies, and Ethan had spent so much time fighting it that he had lost sight of the most important thing, his own integrity. He dialed Sarah's number, praying she was still safe. When she answered, her voice was shaky but alive. "Ethan, are you okay?" "I'm coming home," he whispered, a weight lifting from his chest. Within hours, Malachi's empire crumbled. The raids had been successful, and the connections had been severed. The people who had protected him, politicians, businessmen, crooked cops, were exposed. Malachi was caught, and his reign of terror over the city finally ended. But for Ethan, the real battle had just begun. He had lost so much in this war: his innocence, his ideals, and, at times, even his humanity. But he had found something in return: a deeper understanding of who he truly was. The line between good and evil was often blurred, and in the end, it wasn't about the people you brought down, it was about the person you chose to be. As he embraced his family that night, the city outside seemed quieter and safer, for the first time in a long while. But the lessons of the battle would stay with him forever. Power, greed, and control were only fleeting illusions. What mattered most were the people who loved you and the choices you made along the way. Ethan had fought for survival, but in the end, he'd learned to fight for something greater: redemption.